All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to Gulf Specimen Marine Lab's Friday live feed. We'd like you to stay tuned and ask us lots of questions. Today's topic is on rays and skates, or what are now often being referred to as the flat sharks. This is our southern stingray tank. The southern stingray is the larger of the two species of stingrays that we have here in the Gulf of Mexico. These will get to be about 5 to, I've heard even 6, some reports of even 8 feet across, but they are very large. And what makes an organism a ray rather than a shark, and they are very, very closely related, is the fact that rays have their pectoral fins. Those fins on the sides of their body are connected to the head, and they use them kind of like a bird or a bat uses wings to swim. And they also have their gills on the bottom side of their body. Sharks have their gills on the side, and rays also have a little opening at the upper surface right behind the eyes called the spiracle. And that's used to pull water from the top of the animal down over their gills because they like to be on the bottom. Rays and skates are said to be depressed. Doesn't mean they're unhappy. It just means they're flattened from the top to the bottom. Most of them have a long whip-like tail. Some of them, the tail is much shorter. In most of them, the body's going to be round to diamond-shaped. They usually feed on worms and clams and things that they can suck up from the bottom. But we're going to take you out where we have a little bit better light and where we have some other examples. But we can't really take these big southern rays out and put them in a tank or a tray. They're just too big. So we wanted to be able to show those right here at the beginning of the program.
All right, let's go.
Okay, thank you. About 8 to 10 feet across. The pectoral fins can be 4 to 5, and they fit together, and they can move them back and forth to crush their food, like if they've eaten a clam or a crab or something that's crunchy and needs to be crushed. These are wonderful. It's just wonderful dentition for crushing. And if you ever get bitten by a stingray or another ray, what happens is that you just get your finger kind of doesn't, you know, it's not going to bite your finger off or anything because of the type of teeth that are present. Being a barb, that's what makes them a stingray. And the rays that we were just looking at, the southern stingrays, I have a barb from one of those. And on the back side, there's a groove. And this groove is attached to a venom sac. And when they elevate this barb, the muscles squeeze the venom sac, and the venom comes up through this groove and into the wound. Obviously, this is going to make a really deep, nasty puncture wound, and it's going to be very, very painful. There have the people are in shock because the wound is just so painful. You know, the crocodile hunter who got killed essentially by a stingray, that was a very unusual situation, and the barb caught him right in the heart. And it doesn't happen unless you step right down on the ray. And if you get right, and they bury in the bottom so you may not see them, so if you step down on them, they usually whip that tail up, and that barb is usually going to catch. Now, I do want to tell you how to treat a stingray wound. I hope none of you are going to do the stingray shuffle when you're at the beach, which means so that they can feel those vibrations and feel you coming and get out of the way. But if you ever do, water, just as hot as you can stand it, like really hot bath water, coffee, just as hot as you can stand it for about 20 to 30 minutes, and the heat breaks down the toxin, and so that's what is going to help the pain, because otherwise you're going to be a lot of pain. And like I said, some people get real shocky, which means there's and that can be a fatal. People die every year from shock from lots of different kinds of things, but stingray wounds do cause people to go into shock. Other rays also have barbs, but they don't always have a, usually they don't use the barbs as often as the stingrays do. And so this is the barb from a big eagle ray set of teeth. Okay, I want to talk about this little guy. This is our second stingray that's common in the Gulf. This one is much smaller, and this one will get about twice as big as it is right now, big as the southern stingrays. This is called the Atlantic stingray, and they come in real close to shore. They like to bury up in the sand. This is the one that people encounter most often. I want to show you where the barb is on the tail. We took the barb off here, but we only took part of it off. The rest of it is embedded in the skin. Tail, and it's enclosed in a nasty, dirty puncture wound. Now, this particular animal is male, and I know that because if you look at the back here, these are the pelvic fins, and attached to the pelvic fins here are these little elongations, which are referred to as claspers. They don't clasp anything. They're used like a penis. And essentially, they're inserted into the body of the female. And we talk a lot about skates and rays, and we oftentimes just talk about them as though they're identical. Stingrays, once they have bred, they give live birth. They have viviparous. Ovo meaning they have a great big nutrient-filled egg, but that egg is going to be retained inside the body of the mother, and the female is going to give birth to live. If they're under stress, so like if you catch them in a seine, or you catch them on a hook and line, oftentimes they may begin to birth the young when they're under stress like that, and that gives the young, if they die, they want to give the young the greatest chance at success. So those young are going to be born prematurely probably, but oftentimes they'll be able to survive. Now, I did see this one time when we were female, and she started giving birth to the young, and I was just astounded because when you see those little teeny stingrays coming out, they're in this neat little package, and the wings are all curled up, and the tail is curled up so that the barb is completely covered, so that when they're being birthed, it's not going to get caught somewhere, it's not going to injure. It's kind of like a old biblical scroll. These little wings just are all rolled up, and usually the young in this particular species are about 4 inches to 6 inches long when they're birthed into the world. So this one is a male. I don't have any females to show you right now, but this one is very, very typical. He's also got some spines along the surface right in the midline of the body. And I want to show you right behind his eyes here are those 2 little openings, the spiracles, and you can see like a little flap that's opening and closing in there, and that little flap helps control the water as he pulls water from the upper surface up over the gills and let you see that the fact that this is what makes him a ray and not a shark. There are some true sharks that are like this little guy. I'm going to try and hold him without him getting choked out. Here, can you see all the slits, open, unprotected gill slits? That I'll try that again. And like a shark, you know, bony fish have a gill cover that helps to protect those, but not in the sharks and rays. And the water is passed right over the gills, and that allows them to ventilate and breathe adequately, even when they're buried. He's tired of being messed with, I think. Over here we have another kind of ray, fly ray, and it has it's differently than most of the stingrays. And if you, Allison is right looking where that spiracle is opening, and these, once again, these eat. These are often found on like muddy bottoms, and they eat lots of little worms and kind of things that they find in those soft, muddy, sandy material. They just disappear. Now this is also a male. You can see these are his pelvic fins, and there are the little claspers, which are actually a part of the fin. Okay, and he, unlike the stingrays, he has this tiny little short tail. It's very little. But this little guy was caught last night. In fact, Allison, our camera person, didn't get back till like 3 in the morning because they were out trying to catch rays. And they were they were trying to catch, we have 2 species of electric ray that are found in the Gulf of Mexico. And many of you may not know that we have electric fishes in the and we also have an electric bony fish that is called a stargazer. Did you want me to try and turn him up, Allison, so you can see the bottom? Let's take a look at his little smiling face.
Oh, he's good. Huh. Up here.
Yeah, that's the openings of the spiracles on the bottom side.
Oh, okay, and this one's the
Okay,
mouth.
some on the others, sometimes you don't, they either don't open, they go directly into the gills, or you can't see them as easily.
Okay.
But anyway, we have this bony electric fish, which is called a stargazer. Has a big head and hides in the sand, and scares a lot of fishermen, especially people who flounder with a gig. They oftentimes may gig a stargazer by mistake, thinking that it's a flounder because they just see a little pair of eyes sticking up out of the sand, and then they get shocked. And then they go, what is that? Okay, but electric rays are also fairly common in the Gulf. We have the lesser electric ray, which is much more common and gets to be about 1.5 to 2 feet long, and what are called torpedo rays, which are larger and rounder, and the one that we have here in the Gulf is very pale. It's almost white. It's kind of a light gray to white color. But I have this this preserved specimen of an electric ray that I wanted to show you, and this shows all of the nerves that go into the electric organ, and the electric organ are right behind the eyes, and here you can see that structure, and essentially nerve cells that are stacked, just like if you guys know how a battery cells in the battery that get stacked on top of one another to store that energy, to store the charge. That's exactly what goes on here. The electric organ is a little battery, and then if you disturb this little ray, he will discharge. It's a pretty good jolt. I mean, it's not going to knock you down or cause you to go unconscious, but you're definitely going to feel it in your hand. It has a much larger charge. It's a larger animal, and if it discharges and you're touching it, it would knock you down and possibly cause you to become unconscious. But all of that innervation into this electric organ allows these little fish to really control. Shot of this picture. This is our lesser electric ray. Larger, rounder, and with right in behind the spiracles, essentially. Like if you see these kidney bean shape right behind the spiracles, and you can see it from the surface.
Is it this thing right here?
Yeah.
It's huge.
It is. It's much larger. Okay? That's what they were hoping to catch last night, ray instead. I want to talk about a couple other rays that we have here in the Gulf, one of which are the Cownose rays, front, and they're a schooling ray. And so you'll see them in little schools, sometimes only 3 or 4, sometimes 50 or 60. So it just depends on food availability and how many are in the area. But this animal gets to about, it'll get 3, sometimes 4 feet across. It's not as big as the eagle rays, but it's a lovely soft brown color, and they're just beautiful to see because they're just flying through the water. Okay, and then before I talk about scapes, I want to talk about manta rays. I'm looking for my manta ray picture. Oh, yeah. Here it is. And the biggest of them, the giant manta, gets to like 26 feet across. I mean, these are really, really large animals, and they're planktonic. And they have these little folds that are on their head that come down underneath the top of the head and create essentially our plankton feeders. They go swimming through the water, funneling water into their mouths and over what are called gill rakers, which are like little tiny cones on the back side of the gills. And that filters off all the plankton, little copepods, tiny little fish, any number of things that it can feed on. But these usually have to have many pounds of food a day because they're so large. And the easiest way for them to get that much food is to feed on that minute microscopic plankton that's abundant in the water. We have 2 species of manta rays in the Gulf. The great big one that gets 25, 26 feet, and fairly close inshore during mating season. I know people who go to Pensacola every year and try and get one of those rooms in the top of the hotels on the beach because they can see the manta rays offshore that have come in to mate. And then we have a smaller one that gets 10 to 12 feet across. That's in a slightly different family, but they're very closely related, the 2 types of manta rays. Okay, now we can talk about scapes. This is the skate that's found in our area. It's called the Clearness skate, and the tissue over the end of the nose is very, very thin, and so basically you see just the cartilage at the end of the snout on this particular depressed elasmobranch flat shark. Okay, no barb. There are spines kind of scattered all over the surface, but the big difference between the rays and the skates is that the skates do not give live birth. They have a big yolk-filled egg, and it's laid in a little rectangular shell that has little tendrils on it that wrap around algae or soft coral, and that kind of anchors the egg onto the bottom, essentially, until it hatches. So the big difference between skates, which don't get as big usually as rays, and rays is the reproduction. These lay eggs, the rays give live birth. Have we got any questions on here, Allison?
Just a couple. Charlene Williams, she was asking if this little guy's barb has it been removed?
About half of it has been removed.
Yeah.
I think that they were reluctant to get the clippers in real close to the base. And this one probably will disintegrate, but he'll grow another one. So even though we take the barbs off because we have to work with these animals all the time and we don't want them to injure someone who might inadvertently stick their hands in the wrong tank, but they will. I've seen barbs, which means that theirs got injured and they grew new ones.
Do you want to talk about that big model behind you?
I do. We talked about the east, but let's talk about this guy. This is a sawfish, and sawfish look a lot like a shark. Remember, the sharks and the rays are very closely related, and there are several animals that are kind of in between sharks and rays. Sawfish are officially a ray because the gills are on the bottom. They're very flattened and somewhat similar, and they have their gills on the side, so they're a shark. But we have guitarfish. It's another elasmobranch that's kind of sharky looking, but also very flattened. So it's kind of halfway between. Fish is one of the largest predators that we have here in the northern Gulf. The model represents an animal that is, oh gosh, I would say at least 10 feet long, including the saw. And the saw are, it's a big long snout with modified teeth, and he takes that snout and slashes it back and forth through a school of fish. The teeth injure some of the fish, and that allows him to feed on several animals at a time, so that he feeds on small things, but he gets a lot of them all at once. But there are a couple of other things I wanted to mention. He's got sand all over him, but this is the spear, okay? And although I can't really lift this model up, the gills are right in here, under the very top. Let me see if I can.
It's big.
I can lift him up a little bit. You can maybe see.
Oh, you can see his mouth, and yep, his gills over here.
Okay, so he is actually a ray.
5 gills.
On the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, and spiracles to help get the water down over those gills. But certainly a very large ray and very shark-like in much of its appearance.
We have a question. Is this sawtooth display life-sized?
Yes. Yes, it is.
How about the eagle ray?
The eagle ray is also life-size. In fact, eagle rays will get a little bit bigger than this model.
You can stand over there to see
Sure,
as comparison. Yes.
For scale?
Yes.
Nope.
They're huge. All right.
But yep, this guy is a life-size model of obviously a very large shark. Yeah, I don't see many sawfish this big. In fact, I've not seen many sawfish to begin with, but I've not seen one anywhere near this size.
Are they endangered?
They are, I don't know whether they're classified as endangered, but they are threatened in at least parts of their range. I know we have a professor at FSU who is studying the ecology of sawfish, and trying to determine, you know, whether our populations are in good shape or not.
Okay, we have a question from Jennifer Hall, and she asks, how many different types of rays are there?
There are about, depending on which book you read, 500 to 600 types of rays all over the world. Actually, in freshwater, there are a number of freshwater river stingrays that are, there's one in South America, I believe there's some in Africa, and I recently read that this guy comes right up into the St. Johns River here in Florida and into lakes. That there are scientists who believe that those populations in those lakes are landlocked and that it is functioning essentially as a freshwater organism. Sharks and rays are kind of unusual in that, you know, most fish regulate the concentration of salts in their body cells, osmoregulate by pumping sodium back and forth, sometimes across the gills, etc. But sharks and rays actually osmoregulate using urea. They have urea in the blood and somewhat in the cells, and that they use that to osmoregulate and other things. There are sharks that come up into freshwater like bull sharks, but they can't breed in the freshwater. In order for those pups to survive, they need to be in salt water. So freshwater rays is a pretty nifty little trait.
Okay, we have a question from for poisonous. Can you eat them?
Okay, poisonous usually means that you're going to ingest a toxin. Okay, so like when you get food poisoning, you ingested that toxin. Okay, and that's other things are venomous, like when you get bit by a snake and they inject a venom. That's a toxin that is not ingested but gets into you some other way. Rays are venomous, okay? And stingrays in particular are venomous, but they are not poisonous. You can eat them, and in fact many people do eat the wings. Okay, I've heard that sometimes they punched the wings and made like little fake scallops because it's very muscular in there. Some cultures make one of those nice thick gelatinous soups out of ray wings, similar to shark fin soup. And once again, you know, it would be very similar because they're closely related.
And do they have bones?
No, no bones. Not a single bone anywhere. Now, they do get calcium carbonate that attaches to the cartilage and makes the cartilage stiffer in some areas. Like if you were to see the cranium, the structure in the skull that protects the brain in sharks or rays, it's usually pretty hard because it has a lot of calcium in it. The jaws have a lot of calcium in them, but there's no true bone tissue at all. And you can, if you look at bony tissue under a microscope, it's very, very different than what you see in cartilage, and it has a very different structure. It's formed in a different way. These guys have cartilage with calcium that makes them hard, but it's not bone. They also make dentine, and their scales in both sharks and rays are actually tiny little teeth, and those teeth have a dentin covering, just like your teeth have dentin on the outside, which is very, very hard. But once again, it's not bone. It's a different tissue and a different structure. If you look at these plates in these eagle plates, you can see that real surface, and there's some striation in there that you can see a little bit about how the dentin is laid down on the surface of. These are all modified teeth.
Okay, Lisa Hurst asks, is there a naturally occurring freshwater Florida?
No, but these are tributaries into fresh water.
Is there a reason why they do that?
You know, I'm guessing they're following food. So I don't think they have, you know, I don't think they have a need for fresh water. But I think they've probably just found a food source that works for them.
Most of the skates and rays you have in here, they can be found in Florida, right?
Yes, most of the pictures that I have here, I'm tripping over an alligator here, are things that are found in Florida. So like this big, sometimes it's called the giant manta ray, that's found offshore in the waters of the Gulf. The butterfly rays, like the little one we have over here, this is the one that's found
right outside.
Yep. This is the southern, or no, this is the Atlantic stingray, and this is the southern stingray like we started out with at the tank. And those are the two that are common here in the Gulf. Cownose rays, very common here in the Gulf.
I've seen a migration of them in Port St. Joe.
Yeah, they're so neat when you see a whole school of them.
Yeah, you can find these in Port St. Joe too. I've seen one about the size of my entire body at Port St. Joe.
I would imagine. And that was probably a tiny one.
Probably. So we have a ton of rays and skates in Florida.
We do. They are a very common part of our coastal habitat.
Now a lot of people are afraid of them. Do you think they should be?
I think you should be cautious, and I think you should...
Do you want to show us how to do a stingray shuffle?
Yeah. You just want to shuffle your feet like this as you're going through the sand, vibrations through the sand in front of you. It's because they don't want to be stepped on, and like most people who get nailed by a stingray, it's because they accidentally stepped right down on it. Like they're bringing the boat into the beach, and they're getting ready, and they jump off the boat and hit a stingray, or they're fording a little tidal stream while they're fishing and they just step on one accidentally because you can't, they're usually buried, and so you don't see them.
All right, and that's all we have for questions.
Okay, well, go ahead and email us any questions, or on Facebook, write those questions in and we'll check those this evening if you have any more questions. But thank you so much for staying with us during our live feed. Come again next Friday, and we're now open for reservations and limited parties to come into the aquarium area. So please come by if you're local. We would love to have you.
Yep, and come see our stingrays.
Yeah, come see the stingrays.